My name is Haroon. I'm 47 years old, and on June 29th, 2019, I was sentenced to death by beheading in Damascus, Syria, for abandoning Islam. I was an imam for 23 years, respected by thousands, honored in my community. But that day changed everything when Jesus intervened in the most impossible way imaginable. It started with dreams that I couldn't shake from my mind. Night after night, the same vision would come to me as I slept. A man dressed in brilliant white robes would appear, calling my name with such tenderness that I would wake with tears streaming down my face. His voice was unlike anything I had ever heard during my 23 years as an imam. It carried an authority that made my soul tremble, yet it was filled with a love so pure that it pierced through every defense I had built around my heart. For months, I dismissed these dreams as nothing more than stress from the heavy responsibilities of leading the Al Noor Mosque in Damascus. I told myself that the pressure of teaching hundreds of children, conducting 5 daily prayers, and counseling families through their struggles was simply manifesting in my sleep. I convinced myself that these visions meant nothing, that they were just my mind's way of processing the weight of spiritual leadership that rested on my shoulders. But the dreams persisted. Every night, this man in white would extend his hand toward me, and I could feel an overwhelming peace radiating from his presence. He never spoke many words, but when he did, they cut straight to the deepest parts of my being. One night, he said simply, "Come, follow me, and I will give you rest." I woke up gasping, my prayer rug soaked with sweat, wondering why those particular words felt so familiar, yet so foreign to everything I had been taught. I'm asking you to imagine questioning everything you've built your life upon. Picture the terror of doubting not just your career or your relationships, but the very foundation of your eternal soul. That's where I found myself as these dreams continued. During the day, I would stand before my congregation and recite verses from the Quran with the same passion I had always shown, but inside something was shifting. The words that had once brought me comfort now felt hollow, like an echo in an empty chamber. The turning point came when I couldn't resist the pull any longer. I began secretly studying texts that I had been taught to despise my entire life. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in my study, I kept a small collection of Christian materials that I had acquired through underground networks. The risk was enormous. If discovered, these books would not only cost me my position as imam, but potentially my life. Yet I found myself drawn to them, like a man dying of thirst is drawn to water. Reading about Jesus felt like coming home to a place I had never been. The stories of his compassion, his miracles, his sacrifice spoke to something deep within my spirit that had been yearning for truth all along. When I read his words about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek, I wept because I finally understood what my dreams had been trying to tell me. This was the man in white who had been calling my name night after night. The internal battle was fierce. Everything in my religious training screamed that what I was feeling was deception, that I was being led astray by forces of darkness. But my heart recognized the voice of the shepherd, even though my mind couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what was happening to me. I would spend hours in my prayer room, surrounded by Islamic texts and prayer beads, wrestling with God in a way I had never done before. It was in that sacred space, where I had led countless prayer sessions and meditation times, that everything changed forever. On a quiet Thursday evening in March, after my family had gone to sleep, I found myself on my knees in desperation. I was exhausted from months of internal conflict, tired of living a double life, weary from the weight of pretending that everything was normal when my entire worldview was crumbling. In my prayer room, I whispered the words that would seal my fate. Jesus, if you are real, if you are truly the Son of God, show me the truth. I surrender everything to you. The moment those words left my lips, I felt a presence fill that room unlike anything I had ever experienced in all my years of Islamic prayer. It was the same presence from my dreams, but now it was tangible, real, surrounding me with a love so profound that I couldn't stop sobbing. From that night forward, my secret faith began to grow. I continued my duties as imam by day, but by night I was learning about Jesus, studying his teachings, and praying to him with a fervor that surprised even me. I began teaching my own children about Jesus in careful, subtle ways, thinking no one would ever discover what was happening in my heart. I would tell them stories that sounded like Islamic parables, but were actually taken from the Gospels. I thought I was being clever, that I could live in both worlds without consequence. The change in my preaching was gradual but noticeable. Where I once spoke with rigid adherence to traditional Islamic doctrine, I began emphasizing themes of love, forgiveness, and personal relationship with God. My congregation seemed to appreciate this softer approach, not realizing that I was slowly weaving Christian principles into my Friday sermons. The dangerous moment came when I became so comfortable in my new faith that I made a fatal error. During one particularly passionate Friday prayer service, as I was speaking about God's mercy and grace, I accidentally quoted Jesus directly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The mosque fell silent. Several of the religious scholars in the front row exchanged glances, and I knew immediately that I had exposed myself. That single moment of carelessness would eventually lead to my death sentence, but in that instant, all I felt was the profound truth of those words echoing in my heart. The anonymous tip came from someone I had trusted, someone who had sat in my congregation for years listening to my teachings. I never discovered who it was, but I suspect it was one of the religious scholars who had heard me quote Jesus that fateful Friday. Within 3 days of that slip of the tongue, my entire world came crashing down around me like a building demolished by dynamite. It was dawn on a Tuesday morning when they came for me. I was performing my morning prayers, ironically praying to Jesus while going through the motions of Islamic ritual, when I heard the heavy pounding on my front door. The sound echoed through our small house like thunder, and I knew immediately that this was not a social visit. My wife's terrified screams still echo in my mind when I think back to that moment. She knew as I did that men who pound on doors at dawn rarely bring good news. 3 men in black robes stood at my doorway, their faces stern and unmerciful. Behind them stood 2 armed guards, their hands resting on their weapons as if they expected me to resist. The lead man, an elderly scholar I recognized from the Regional Islamic Council, spoke with cold authority that made my blood freeze. "Imam Harun, you are under arrest for the crimes of apostasy and corrupting the faithful. You will come with us immediately." My children watched from the hallway as these men dragged me from my home in chains. The look of confusion and terror in their young eyes haunts me to this day. My youngest daughter, only 8 years old, cried out for me as they forced me into their vehicle. My wife stood in our doorway, her face pale with shock, unable to comprehend how the man she'd been married to for 15 years could suddenly be branded a criminal worthy of death. The journey to the Islamic court felt like riding to my own funeral. Through the barred windows of the transport vehicle, I could see neighbors and community members lining the streets, word having spread quickly about my arrest. Some looked shocked, others appeared satisfied as if they had been waiting for this moment. I realized that my gradual transformation had been more noticeable than I had believed. People had been watching, listening, waiting for confirmation of their suspicions. The courthouse was packed with religious leaders, community elders, and curious onlookers who had come to witness what they believed would be a swift trial and certain conviction. As they dragged me through the crowd in chains, people who had once greeted me with respect and admiration now looked at me with disgust and betrayal. Former friends turned their backs as I passed. Children I had taught pointed at me with shame in their eyes. The trial itself was a mockery of justice, though I had expected nothing different. Islamic law regarding apostasy is clear and unforgiving. The evidence against me was overwhelming, not because of any elaborate investigation, but because my own words condemned me. They had witnesses who testified to hearing me quote Christian scripture. They had reports of subtle changes in my teaching style. Most damning of all, they had discovered my hidden collection of Christian books during a search of my home. When they presented those books as evidence, holding them up for the entire courtroom to see, I felt a strange mixture of fear and pride. Fear because I knew these books sealed my fate, but pride because I realized I was no longer hiding who I had become. The judge, a man I had known for years and had even shared meals with, looked at me with a combination of disappointment and righteous anger. The questioning was brutal and humiliating. They demanded that I recant my faith in Jesus Christ and return to Orthodox Islamic belief. They offered me chances to save my life by publicly denouncing Christianity and reaffirming my commitment to Islam. Ask yourself this question: what would you do when faced with the choice between your life and your faith? Would you have the courage to stand firm when everything you hold dear hangs in the balance? I found strength I never knew I possessed. When they asked me to deny Jesus, I looked directly into the judge's eyes and said clearly, "I cannot deny the one who died for me. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and I would rather die than betray him." The courtroom erupted in angry shouts and gasps of disbelief. Several people had to be restrained from rushing forward to attack me right there in the courtroom. The judge's voice boomed across the packed room as he pronounced my sentence. for the crimes of apostasy. Abandoning the Islamic faith and corrupting the minds of the faithful with Christian heresy, you are sentenced to death by public beheading. May Allah have mercy on your corrupted soul. The words hit me like physical blows, even though I had known this moment was coming from the instant they arrested me. My family's reaction was perhaps more painful than the death sentence itself. My wife, who had loved me faithfully for 15 years, looked at me as if I had become a stranger. She later told the court that she no longer recognized the man she had married, that the Harun she knew would never have abandoned their faith and brought such shame upon their family. 2 of my children stood with her, their faces filled with confusion and hurt, but my youngest son looked at me differently. In his eyes, I saw not condemnation, but curiosity, as if he was trying to understand what could be so powerful that his father would die for it. The congregation I had served for over 2 decades turned their backs on me completely. People I had married, families I had comforted during times of loss, young men I had guided through their spiritual development, they all abandoned me as if I had never existed. Former friends crossed the street to avoid even looking at me. The community that had once honored me now treated me like a disease that needed to be eliminated. During my 3 days in solitary confinement before the execution, I had time to reflect on the cost of following Jesus. The cell was small, cold, and dark, but I found a peace there that I had never experienced as an imam. I spent those final days praying, not for rescue or for my life to be spared, but for strength to face death with dignity and for my family to somehow understand that what I had found was worth dying for. June 29th, 2019. I remember every sound, every smell, every sensation of that morning as if it happened yesterday instead of over 5 years ago. The metal door of my cell creaked open at exactly 5:30 a.m., and the guard who entered avoided making eye contact with me. Perhaps he had developed some sympathy for me during my 3 days of confinement, or perhaps he simply couldn't bear to look at a man he knew would be dead within hours. Either way, his silence spoke volumes about the gravity of what was about to unfold. They offered me a final meal, as is customary before executions, but I refused it. My stomach was churning with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and I knew that food would only make me sick. Instead, I asked for time to pray, and surprisingly, they granted this request. I suppose even my executioners recognized that a man facing death deserves a few moments with his God, regardless of which God that might be. Those final hours of prayer were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Sitting alone in that cold stone cell, I felt the presence of Jesus more powerfully than I had since my conversion. I prayed not for a last-minute reprieve or miraculous escape, but for courage to face death with dignity and for my testimony to somehow reach others who might be searching for truth as I had been. I asked God to use my death for His glory, never imagining that He had an entirely different plan in mind. At 9 a.m. sharp, the guards returned to my cell. This time there were 4 of them, all armed, all wearing the stern expressions of men carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty. The head guard, a thick-set man with graying hair, spoke in a voice that was neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. "It is time, Harun. You will walk to your execution with whatever dignity you can muster." They chained my hands and feet like I was a dangerous criminal, as if a 47-year-old former imam posed some threat to these armed men. The chains were heavy and cold against my skin, and they made a terrible clanking sound with every step I took. That sound became the rhythm of my final walk as a condemned man, each clank marking another step closer to what everyone believed would be my death. The walk from the prison to the public square took nearly 20 minutes, and it felt like walking through the valley of the shadow of death that David wrote about in the Psalms. The route was lined with people who had once respected me, people who had sought my counsel and guidance, people who had trusted me with their deepest spiritual needs. Now they formed a gauntlet of hatred and condemnation that I had to walk through to reach my execution. Former students I had taught the Quran spat at me as I passed. Their faces were twisted with a disgust that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. These were young men I had watched grow up, boys I had helped guide through their teenage years. And now they looked at me as if I was the embodiment of everything evil in the world. The betrayal in their eyes was almost unbearable to witness. Families I had married threw stones that struck my shoulders and back. I thought about the joy on their faces during their wedding ceremonies, how honored they had felt to have me perform their marriages, and how that honor had transformed into shame and rage. Women whose children I had blessed covered their faces and turned away, as if even looking at me would contaminate them with my supposed corruption. The crowd grew larger and more hostile as we approached the public square. Word of my execution had spread throughout Damascus, and people had traveled from neighboring districts to witness what they believed would be justice served. Their shouts and curses created a wall of sound that was almost deafening. Traitor! Blasphemer! Death to the apostate! The words hammered against me like physical blows, but underneath the fear and pain, I felt a strange sense of peace growing stronger with each step. When we finally reached the execution site, I saw the executioner for the first time. He was a massive man, easily 6 feet tall and built like a warrior. His face was covered with a black cloth, but his eyes were visible, and they showed no emotion whatsoever. This was a professional killer, a man who had performed this gruesome task many times before. In his hands he held the sword that was meant to end my life, and the blade gleamed in the morning sunlight like a thing alive. The executioner spent several minutes preparing for his task. He tested the sharpness of his blade by cutting through several pieces of rope. He practiced his swing, checking the angle and the arc of his movement. He adjusted his stance and his grip on the sword handle. All of this preparation took place in full view of the crowd, which seemed to enjoy the theater of it all. They wanted to savor every moment of my humiliation and death. As I knelt on the cold stone platform where so many others had died before me, I looked out at the sea of faces surrounding me. Some showed savage satisfaction, others appeared uncomfortable with what they were about to witness, but all of them believed they were about to see justice carried out according to their religious law. None of them, including myself, could have imagined what was actually about to happen. The executioner took his position behind me and raised his sword high above his head. The crowd fell silent in anticipation of the final moment. I could feel the shadow of the blade as it blocked out the sun above me. Time seemed to slow down, and in that eternal moment between life and death, I prayed the same words that Jesus had spoken on the cross. Into your hands I commit my spirit. As I knelt there on that execution platform, feeling the cold stone beneath my knees and the weight of my chains around my wrists, I had no idea that I was about to witness the most incredible display of God's power that any human being has ever seen. I thought I was about to die for my faith. Instead, I was about to live because of a miracle that would change not only my life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it that day. The executioner's sword reached the highest point of its arc, and I could sense the crowd holding its collective breath in anticipation. The morning sun reflected off the polished blade, creating a flash of light that seemed to cut through the air above my head. In that moment, suspended between life and death, I felt a supernatural peace wash over me that I had never experienced before, not even during my most profound moments of prayer as an imam. Then, without any warning whatsoever, the earth beneath us began to shake with a violence that defied explanation. It wasn't the gradual building of seismic activity that you might expect from a natural earthquake. This was immediate, powerful, and unlike anything any of us had ever felt before. The ground literally convulsed beneath the execution platform, causing the massive stone blocks to crack and shift with sounds like thunder. I watched in absolute amazement as the executioner, this giant of a man who had seemed so confident and controlled just moments before, began to stagger and stumble as the earth moved beneath his feet. The sword that had been raised to kill me wavered in his grip as he fought to maintain his balance. His professional composure completely shattered as the shaking intensified, and I could see genuine fear beginning to replace the cold determination in his eyes. The crowd that had been so eager for my blood just seconds earlier was now scrambling in panic as the violent trembling continued. People who had been standing shoulder to shoulder were suddenly thrown against each other, some falling to the ground as their legs gave way beneath them. The organized rows of spectators devolved into chaos as everyone tried to understand what was happening to their world. For 30 full seconds, the earth shook with such intensity that no one could remain standing except by pure will and determination. I somehow managed to stay upright on my knees, though the chains around my wrists rattled violently and the stone platform beneath me developed deep cracks that spread out like spider webs. The sound was deafening, a combination of grinding stone, rattling metal, and the terrified screams of hundreds of people who had never experienced anything like this before. But the earthquake was only the beginning of what would happen that day. As the ground finally began to stabilize, something even more extraordinary occurred. Every single light in the public square began to flicker rapidly, creating a strobe effect that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The street lamps, the lights on the surrounding buildings, Even the electronic displays on nearby shops all began to pulse in perfect unison as if controlled by some invisible hand. Ask yourself this question: have you ever seen every electrical system in a city block malfunction at exactly the same moment? The probability of such an occurrence happening naturally is virtually impossible, yet that's exactly what we all witnessed that day. The flickering lights created an otherworldly atmosphere that made everyone in the square look around in bewilderment and growing terror. Then, as suddenly as the flickering had begun, every single light went out completely. In the middle of the morning, under a bright, clear sky, we were plunged into absolute darkness for what felt like an eternity, but was actually close to 1 full minute. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. It was as if someone had thrown a massive blanket over the entire city of Damascus. The silence during that minute of darkness was perhaps more unnerving than the earthquake had been. The screaming stopped. The panic seemed to freeze in place. Hundreds of people stood in complete darkness, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. It was a darkness that seemed to press against us physically, a darkness that felt alive and purposeful rather than merely the absence of light. When the lights suddenly returned, flooding the square with normal daylight once again, the scene before me was completely transformed. The executioner, this massive man who had been prepared to take my life without hesitation, was now on his knees beside me on the execution platform. His sword lay on the ground several feet away, apparently dropped during the supernatural events we had just experienced. His entire body was trembling, not from the earthquake, which had already stopped, but from something much deeper and more profound. I turned to look at him, and what I saw in his eyes was pure terror, mixed with something I could only describe as recognition. It was as if he had seen something during that minute of darkness that had shaken him to the very core of his being. His hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't have held his sword even if he had wanted to pick it up again. The crowd's reaction was even more dramatic than the executioner's transformation. What had been an organized gathering of bloodthirsty spectators just minutes before was now a scene of absolute pandemonium. People were running in every direction, trampling over each other in their desperate attempts to escape the square. Mothers grabbed their children and fled without looking back. Elderly men who had hobbled to the execution site with walking sticks were somehow finding the strength to run faster than teenagers. The guards who had been stationed around the perimeter to maintain order had completely abandoned their posts. These were trained soldiers. Men who had faced combat and danger without flinching, yet they were fleeing like children afraid of the dark. I watched as they threw down their weapons and ran, their faces pale with a terror that went far beyond anything they had been trained to handle. Even the religious leaders who had been so eager to see me executed were scattering like leaves in a windstorm. The very men who had condemned me to death, who had quoted scripture about the necessity of executing apostates, were now running away as fast as their robes would allow them to move. Their certainty about God's will had been shaken to its foundation by what they had just witnessed. As I knelt there on the cracked execution platform, watching the complete evacuation of the public square, I realized that something miraculous had just occurred. My chains, which had been securely fastened just minutes before, were now loose around my wrists. I don't know how or when they had been loosened, but I was able to simply slide them off my hands and let them fall to the ground with a metallic clank that echoed through the now empty square. Within 5 minutes of the earthquake and the darkness, I found myself completely alone in what had been a crowded public execution. The executioner was gone, the guards were gone, the crowd was gone. Even the religious officials who had orchestrated my death sentence had fled the scene. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking from the adrenaline and shock of what had just happened, and I was free. Standing alone in that empty public square, surrounded by the debris of scattered shoes, abandoned weapons, and the sword that was meant to end my life, I felt like I was living in a dream. The silence was deafening after the chaos that had just unfolded. My legs were trembling so badly that I had to grip the edge of the execution platform to steady myself. The reality of what had just happened was almost too overwhelming for my mind to process. I took my first steps as a free man through the deserted streets of Damascus, and every footfall felt surreal. The chains that had bound me lay forgotten on the cracked stone behind me, and my wrists still bore the red marks where they had chafed against my skin. The morning sun felt different on my face now, warmer somehow, as if I was experiencing sunlight for the first time in my life. I had walked to that square expecting to die, and now I was walking away from it as a living witness to the power of God. The streets that had been lined with angry faces just an hour earlier were now completely empty. It was as if the entire population of Damascus had simply vanished into thin air. Shops were abandoned with their doors still open, their owners having fled so quickly that they hadn't even taken time to secure their businesses. Cars sat empty in the middle of the road, their drivers having apparently jumped out and run on foot when the earthquake struck. As I walked through these ghost-like streets, I couldn't help but marvel at the completeness of the exodus. Not a single person remained in the entire district. Windows that had been filled with curious faces watching my march to execution were now empty and dark. The only sounds I could hear were my own footsteps echoing off the walls of abandoned buildings, and the distant wail of car alarms that had been triggered by the earthquake. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, what would you be thinking if you had just witnessed the impossible? How would you process an event that defied every law of nature and probability that you had ever known? I found myself alternating between overwhelming gratitude and complete bewilderment. Part of me wanted to fall on my knees and worship God right there in the street, while another part of me wondered if I was having some kind of hallucination brought on by the trauma of facing death. After walking for nearly an hour through the empty city, I finally encountered another human being. An elderly woman peered at me cautiously from behind a partially closed door, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. When she realized who I was, she quickly shut the door, and I heard the sound of multiple locks being turned. Word would spread quickly that the condemned imam had somehow survived his execution, and I knew that my freedom would be short-lived if I remained in Damascus. That's when I remembered the underground Christian network that I had heard whispered about during my secret study of the faith. These were brave believers who helped converts escape persecution, and I knew that if anyone could help me now, it would be them. The challenge was finding them without exposing myself to the authorities, who would surely be looking for me once they realized what had happened at the execution site. I made my way to a small coffee shop in the old quarter of the city that I had heard mentioned in hushed conversations. The owner, a middle-aged man named Brother Samuel, took one look at me and immediately understood the situation. Without asking any questions, he ushered me into a back room and provided me with civilian clothes to replace the white execution garments I was still wearing. His hands shook as he helped me change, and I could see that he was both terrified and amazed to be harboring the man who had supposedly been executed that morning. Brother Samuel explained that the entire city was in chaos. News of the earthquake and the supernatural darkness had spread like wildfire, but the most shocking news was that the condemned imam had simply vanished from the execution site. The authorities were claiming that I had somehow escaped during the confusion, but there were hundreds of witnesses who swore that they had seen something far more extraordinary than a simple prison break. The underground network moved with remarkable efficiency. Within hours, they had arranged for my transportation out of Damascus. I was hidden in the back of a supply truck headed for the Lebanese border, surrounded by bags of grain and boxes of medical supplies that were being delivered to refugee camps. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now fleeing my homeland as a refugee, just like the thousands of people I had once counseled as their imam. The 3-day journey to safety was both physically grueling and emotionally overwhelming. I was crammed into a space barely large enough for my body, with little food or water, bouncing along rough roads that seemed to go on forever. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental anguish of leaving behind everything and everyone I had ever known. Every mile that truck traveled took me further away from my old life and deeper into an uncertain future. During those long hours in darkness, I had time to reflect on the magnitude of what had happened. The hardest part wasn't facing death, as terrifying as that had been. The hardest part was accepting that I would probably never see half of my family again. My wife had made it clear during the trial that she could never accept my conversion to Christianity. My eldest son had stood with her, his face filled with shame and disappointment. Only my 2 younger children had looked at me with anything resembling understanding, and even they were too young to fully comprehend what was happening. When we finally reached the refugee camp in Lebanon, I was overwhelmed by the sight of thousands of people who, like me, had been forced to abandon everything they held dear because of their faith. These were Christians who had fled persecution in Syria, Iraq, and other parts of the Middle East. They welcomed me, not as the former imam who had betrayed Islam, but as a brother who had paid a tremendous price to follow Jesus. The first time I shared my testimony in that refugee camp, sitting around a small fire with a dozen other believers, I realized that God had indeed answered my prayer. He hadn't spared my life simply so I could live quietly in exile. He had miraculously rescued me so that I could tell the world about his power and his love. The earthquake and the darkness weren't just displays of divine intervention, they were God's way of ensuring that my story would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Within weeks, my family situation became clearer. My youngest son and daughter, along with my brother and his wife, made the dangerous journey to join me in Lebanon. They had witnessed the aftermath of my miraculous escape and had become believers themselves. But my wife and eldest son remained in Damascus, choosing their cultural and religious traditions over our family unity. The pain of that separation still aches in my heart today, but I've learned that following Jesus sometimes requires sacrifices that seem almost unbearable. Today I stand before you, not as Imam Harun, the respected religious leader I once was, but as Brother Harun, a man who has been completely transformed by the miraculous power of Jesus Christ. The journey from that refugee camp in Lebanon to where I am today has been filled with challenges, blessings, and opportunities that I never could have imagined when I was leading prayers at the Al-Noor Mosque in Damascus. After several months in the Lebanese refugee camp, sharing my testimony with fellow believers and learning to live as a Christian in exile, God opened a door for me to relocate to Jordan. A Christian relief organization had heard about my story and offered to sponsor my resettlement, recognizing that my unique background as a former imam could be valuable in their ministry to Muslim converts throughout the Middle East. The transition to life in Jordan was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time since my conversion, I was living in a place where I could openly practice my Christian faith without fear of immediate execution. Yet the weight of responsibility was enormous. I knew that hundreds of people were watching my every move, some hoping to see me fail and return to Islam, others looking to me as an example of what it meant to truly follow Jesus, regardless of the cost. I began working with underground networks that provided support and safe passage for Muslims who had converted to Christianity throughout Syria, Iraq, and other parts of the region where such conversions were punishable by death. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, who had once been on the receiving end of such help, was now in a position to offer it to others facing the same persecution I had experienced. My first major project was establishing a safe house in Amman where new converts could stay while arrangements were made for their long-term safety. We started with a small apartment that could house 4 people at a time, but within 6 months we were operating 3 different locations and helping an average of 20 families per month escape religious persecution. The stories these people brought with them were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. I met a former Islamic scholar from Iraq who had been beaten nearly to death by his own brothers when they discovered his conversion. I counseled a woman from Afghanistan who had fled with her 3 young children after her husband threatened to kill them all for her faith in Jesus. Each story reminded me of my own journey and reinforced my conviction that the miracle I had experienced wasn't just for me, but for all these precious souls who needed hope in their darkest moments. One of the most significant developments in my ministry came when I began translating Christian materials into Arabic specifically for Muslims who were seeking truth about Jesus. Most existing translations were done by people who had never lived as devout Muslims, so they often missed the cultural nuances and specific concerns that would arise in the mind of someone raised in Islamic tradition. I spent countless hours working on a translation of the Gospel of John that would speak directly to the questions I had wrestled with during my own conversion. How could God have a son? Why would Jesus need to die for our sins when we could earn salvation through good works? What about the Islamic teaching that the Bible had been corrupted? These were the same questions that had kept me awake at night during my secret study of Christianity. And I knew they were the questions troubling every Muslim who encountered the gospel. The impact of this translation work exceeded my wildest expectations. We began distributing these materials through carefully established networks throughout the Middle East, and the responses we received were overwhelming. Letters arrived from Damascus, Baghdad, Tehran, and dozens of other cities where Muslims had received our materials and were beginning their own spiritual journeys toward Christ. So I'm asking you, just as a grandfather would ask his grandson, can you imagine the joy of knowing that your suffering has become the foundation for other people's freedom? Every sleepless night I had spent in that Damascus prison cell, every moment of terror I had experienced on the execution platform, every tear I had shed over my broken family relationships, all of it had been transformed into a ministry that was literally saving lives. I've seen Jesus work through earthquake and darkness, through the dramatic supernatural intervention that saved my life on that execution platform. But I've also learned that I see him work even more powerfully through the quiet, persistent changes he makes in human hearts day after day. The young Iraqi man who decides to follow Jesus after reading our translation of John's Gospel may never experience an earthquake, but his transformation is no less miraculous than what happened to me. My current work involves training other former Muslims to become effective evangelists and counselors within refugee communities. We've developed a network of safe houses and support systems that spans from Jordan to Turkey to Greece, helping converts find not just physical safety, but also spiritual community and practical skills for rebuilding their lives in new countries. One of the most rewarding aspects of this ministry has been watching my own children grow into strong Christian leaders. My son, who was only 12 when we fled Damascus, now speaks fluent Arabic, English, and French and serves as a translator for refugee families arriving in European countries. My daughter has become passionate about helping women and children who have escaped forced marriages and honor violence because of their faith conversions. The pain of family separation has never completely healed, but it has been transformed into a deep empathy for the thousands of other believers I've met who have made similar sacrifices. Every few months, I receive word through various networks about my wife and eldest son who remained in Damascus. They are safe, but they have never forgiven me for the choice I made. Yet I've learned that following Jesus sometimes requires us to love people from a distance when loving them up close would compromise the very truth that could save their souls. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question: what is Jesus calling you to surrender today? It may not be as dramatic as facing a public execution, but I guarantee that he is asking you to let go of something that you think you need in order to receive something far greater that he wants to give you. They sentenced me to death, but Jesus gave me life eternal. The sword that was meant to silence me forever became the very reason I can never stop speaking his name. Every time I tell this story, I'm reminded that the God who shook the earth and darkened the sky to save one former imam in Damascus is the same God who is working in your life right now, whether you recognize it or not. The executioner's blade never touched my neck, but in many ways I did die that day. The man who walked away from that empty execution platform was not the same person who had knelt there expecting to be killed. Harun the Imam died in Damascus, and Brother Harun was born through the miraculous intervention of Jesus Christ. I close with this promise: the same Jesus who rescued me from certain death is available to rescue you from whatever spiritual darkness you may be facing. You may not need an earthquake to save your physical life, but you definitely need his power to save your eternal soul. Don't wait until you're facing execution to surrender your life to him. The time to follow Jesus is right now, while you still have the freedom to choose.